In a town forgotten by time, where trouble rode in with the wind and legends faded slower than scars, Riva Halden learned the difference between fear and warning. Fear was raw and blind. Warning had a shape. It came in the taste of iron at the back of her throat, in the way the street dogs went quiet at dusk, and in the grinding ache that woke under her ribs just as the lamp in the boarding-house hall guttered to a thin wick. She lay still and counted the ache like a stranger might count coins, one by one, refusing to spend them. Not yet, not here. Hallow Bend was a place the railroad forgot on purpose. The tracks skittered past on a distant ridge as if the eastbound trains had deliberately leaned away from the town's tilted roofs and bleached fences, from the courthouse that was once white and now the color of old teeth, from the church whose bell had a crack spidering up its rim so that every peal ended with a tinny gasp. The wind dragged grit across the main street and made a whittled music of the shutter slats. In Hallow Bend, people kept their promises and their hatreds the same way, quietly, with their chins set. Riva kept to the edges. She had been in Hallow Bend 8 months and had learned the precise angle at which to carry a basket so men's eyes slid off her and women's sighs softened to something almost like pity. She had learned which boards in the boarding-house stair squealed, and how to fold the quilt to hide the dark spots that bloomed there now from the way her back sweated at night. When she paid, she set her coins gently in Mrs. Deemer's palm so the older woman would not hear their tremble. She saved her words for the one thing that mattered, the one thing that swelled her belly forward and tilted every hour toward arrival. "We will be all right," she whispered to the child who turned and pressed a heel against the inside of her as if knocking at a door. "We will be all right because I will make it so." The town had other plans. On market days, the councilmen stood together like fence posts at the far end of the square, their hats brimmed the same, their boots polished to the same indifferent shine. Elder Pike, who wore his Sunday collar every day of the week as if his neck would otherwise fall off, had a way of looking at Riva as if she were a window with a crack already spreading. Sheriff Brogan, whose badge had been buffed so often it caught stray sun and flung it into people's eyes, carried a toothpick he never chewed. He just let it sit there like a second, meaner smile. And across from them, near the water pump, Eleanora Quaid watched everything with the stillness of a hawk on a fence post. Eleanora was fine-boned, dark-haired, spare. She did not have children. She had money. In Hallow Bend, those two facts met in the council's private conversations like flint and steel. "Girl like that," Sheriff Brogan had once said to Mrs. Deemer while Riva was in the pantry pretending to count jars. "No father attached to her now, no papers, you mark me. The child's better off under managed roofs. We got families who can raise it proper." Mrs. Deemer had shuffled her feet in the flour. "That girl pays her rent on time." Brogan's toothpick tilted. "So do glamblers. Paying rent ain't the same as bein' righteous." Riva had stood in the pantry like a creature made of glass, daring the next word to shatter her. She had no paper to prove what she had lost, and no taste for the town's pity. She had left Poppy Hollow with nothing but a tin brooch and a promise between her teeth, the promise that what grew inside her would be protected. She had not expected the promise itself to become a charge against her. Tonight, the ache came with a new edge. It did not simply press. It tightened, retreated, and returned as if the horizon itself had begun to breathe. She tried to will herself to sleep. The walls hummed with other boarders' dreams. Somewhere someone laughed, but the laugh never reached the throat. It died in the nose, a snort of scorn. Out the window, the lane's dust had settled and become a path of pewter. Riva eased to her side, tucked a palm under the shelf of her belly, and spoke into the dark. "Not yet. We're not ready to run." The child answered with a slow roll, not a kick. Consolation. Agreement. Riva smiled for the first time all day and let her breath even. A boot scuffed in the hall.
The ache retreated as if it too were listening. The scuff came again and stopped outside her door. A paper slid underneath with a sound like a snake dragging its belly over sand. Riva sat up, every breath a step taken toward a precipice, and reached for it. In the dim light, she could not read the cramped, hasty hand, but she recognized the loop of the capital M, May Kettle, the midwife whose hands were always warm. Door latched against prying eyes, steps quiet as a mouse. Come now before the others wake. Stall barn, storm coming. Riva stood, then had to sit again when the ache bit with a mild ferocity that made her bite her lip. When it passed, she dressed quickly. The dress was one she had let out twice by hand. It had once been dove-colored, now it was the ash at the end of a burned page. She wrapped her shawl, tucked the brooch, the tin blossom that had once been her mother's, into the bodice, and lifted the latch as a breeze lifted the curtain. She was out and down the hall before the ache could find her again. The town breathed around her the way sleeping beasts do, with the occasional twitch, the cough, the long sigh. She kept to the alley's crooked seam and slid past the pump where the handle creaked like an old elbow. In the square, the freight wagon stood with its tailboard down, a shadow box full of crates. Riva could have hidden between those boxes, pressed her cheek to rough wood and asked the dawn to carry her away. The ache returned and told her, no, the body is not a crate, it is a clock. She cut behind the smithy and smelled the day's work waiting in black piles, coal, horseshoes, nails. The stall barn crouched at the edge of the fairgrounds like a low, patient beast. Riva felt for her breath again and found it. She slipped inside and swallowed the dark. May Kettle was waiting near stall 3. The midwife's hair, mostly iron and some wire, was pinned in a way that said she had tried for neatness and missed. Her hands were already clean. How far? May asked, without greeting, the way someone might ask how high the river had got. Riva's answer came with the next tightening. They come and go, not long, but sharp. Good, that's a body waking up smart. May touched a palm to Riva's cheek, and the warmth of it leached into her like tea into a blank cup. You're steady, that'll carry you. I had a note, Riva held it out. You said storm. May's jaw worked as if she were chewing a grudge. A storm of tongues. The council had late words. Eleanora Quade's name got said more than once. Sheriff's boys took a walk with a rope in their pocket, not for hanging. Don't you spook, just for tying something up and calling it legal. We do this fast and quiet. The barn's the best we get without rattling every blind on Main. My rent's paid. Riva hated the smallness in her voice. She swallowed and tried again. This is my child. May nodded, a nod that had salt in it. And we'll keep it so. I've got Sol for your back and willow bark for your head. I've got boiled water and boiled words in case a deputy gets smart. I've got my own name and 50 years in this town, and if push comes to shove, I've got a mean left hook I ain't ashamed to use on a councilman. Riva surprised herself by laughing. The laugh shook something loose inside her, like an old nail coming out of a plank. She leaned against the stall door and breathed through another wave while May rubbed her sacrum with firm, knowing circles. Outside, the wind shouldered the barn and the rafters answered with a sleepy creak. The horse in stall 5, a swayback bay, shifted and snorted as if agreeing that the night had got itself too full.
Tell me something nice, Riva said when the wave broke. Tell me the road after this. May considered. I can tell you that the minute that child's in your arms, you'll forget every name that ever got pinned to you like a moth with a needle. I can tell you that the first cry will turn all the blood in your head to light, and the light will stay. I can tell you something else. What? May's face turned toward the barn door. We won't be alone in it. Riva followed her gaze. A figure crossed the slice of moon-cold yard like a shadow that had remembered something and had to come back for it. Tall, coat too long for Hallowben's idea of fashion. Hat brim low, not to conceal, but to keep the drizzle starting in the air off his face.
He moved with the unbothered economy of a man who had learned to carry his tiredness like a coin in his pocket, to be taken out only when there was something worth paying for. The stall barn breathed him in when he stepped inside, and even the sway-backed bay settled as if recognizing the shape of his quiet. He took off his hat without being told, and Riva saw a face made by weather and a pair of eyes that knew their own strength and didn't show it off. He couldn't have been much older than 30, but there was a way his shoulders held themselves that said he had lifted heavier things than crates. His hands were clean, not town clean, but careful clean, as if he had washed in streams and wiped them dry on the lining of his coat rather than on his trousers. "Fen Morrow," May announced, as if she were offering a tool she had kept in a drawer for just such a day. "He's passed through 3 times this year tinkering with clocks and glass and whatever else folks call broken. He minds his business and knows the difference between an extra breath and a last one." "Ma'am," Fen said to Riva, and his voice deepened the quiet instead of breaking it. "May said you might not want a crowd, but you might allow one more pair of steady hands if things got tight." Riva wanted to let him leave. She wanted to keep everyone out until it was only her and May and the child and the work the body knows without witness. But when the next tightening came, it took her breath hard and left behind a wash of nausea and a sound in her throat she didn't recognize, not quite a cry. She grabbed the stall door with both hands, eyes squeezed shut, and rode it. When she opened them, Fen was at her elbow, not touching, but precisely there, as if his body understood a map her mind hadn't drawn yet. "You smell like rain," she said, surprised by her own words. "Been walking in it. Tonight it will want to be more than drizzle." "What are you, Mr. Morrow?" May asked without looking up from the basin she had hauled in. "You stitch, you set bones, you calibrate time. Where'd you learn to stand like you ain't afraid of a woman's labor?" "Walker taught me how to make glass bowls thin as an eggshell and still hold water. War taught me how to catch blood with them. The bowls broke. The hands learned." He shrugged, apology and fact. "I don't push in where I'm not welcome. I only hold what tries to fall." Riva's palm went to the tin brooch at her chest. She thought of the first time she had seen him in Hallow Bend, leaning over old Mr. Duffy's mantel clock with his head cocked, as if he were listening to a dog under the house. He turned the clock face down, slid a long tool into its backside, and coaxed a sound out of it that made Mrs. Duffy start to cry. Later, at dusk, Riva had watched him on the ridge road as a storm rolled in. He had stopped and closed his eyes and stood there like a tree that knew the wind intimately and didn't fright at it. She had thought then, that is a man who has not made a home in fear. Another wave came, stronger now, the kind that made her knees want to forget how to lock. May slid a folded blanket under Riva's hands where they clutched for purchase. Fen wetted a cloth and laid it over the bucket rim. "You'll do great," he said. Not empty praise, but a plain line laid like a plank over a gap. He didn't tell her she was brave, he didn't tell her to be quiet, he didn't say anything that made her feel like both a miracle and a sin. They made of stall 3 a little world. The slats kept the wind out, and the oil lamp made a steady aureola. Riva paced in the circle May drew with her hands, and each time she reached the missing board by the feeder, she turned and let the pain take her and pass. Between the waves she drank, between the waves she rested her forehead on her forearm and looked at the scuff in the floor where horses had once pawed. Between the waves Fen's voice came like a low tide. "Good, that's right. You're not falling, you're moving forward." When the first honest urge to bear down came, it was not a thought. It was not even a decision. It was the hinge in the body swinging all on its own. Riva made a sound that did not belong to language, and even the swayback bay answered with a tremulous whicker. May's hands gentled and then set, ready. Fen's shadow steadied against the slats as he angled the lamp. The barn breathed with her. The door opened on the second push, not all the way, just enough for a man's voice to flatten itself and slide through. "May Kettle," the voice said, careful, civil, as if the words had been polished to a sheen in someone else's mouth before they came out of this one.
Council says to check on a girl hereabouts. We report she might be a pause, a rearrangement of the mouth, in need of lawful guidance. May didn't turn her head. Am patching a lawful child, she said. Woman's work. Come back after the sun's up and I'll sell you my opinion then. Riva felt her muscles seize and hold. Not fear, not warning, a refusal. The urge went out and left her shaking. Fen moved in a small arc that put his shoulder between the door and Riva's line of sight without blocking May's hands. You hear that? He asked the deputies, his tone so mild it made the hair on Riva's arms lift. She said come back. Another voice joined the first, this one with the lazy curl of a man too sure of his rope. We can wait, Sheriff Brogan said. His toothpick made a shape in the dark. Law don't get sleepy. May's hands never left Riva's hips. Law gets bored, she muttered to Riva's back. It starts to invent reasons to pat itself on the head. Don't let them in your head now. Let the next one come like a wave. You're a cliff. Waves can't argue a cliff into cracking. They gotta carve it over years. And you ain't got years. You've got minutes. Good there. Yes. There it is. Riva closed her eyes and let the next contraction take her weight. It began in her back and moved around to her front and down, and she rode it as if it were a horse that didn't care about her name or her penalties, only about how firmly she sat her seat. The urge came, and she bore down because the body had made its decision, and she was now a witness to it, a co-conspirator more than a commander. When it passed, she felt a flare of heat and then a cold sweat. She heard her own breath sharp as a knife point, and wondered if the deputies outside could hear it too. Sheriff Brogan's voice turned into words aimed at May, but the words were meant to needle Riva. Council says Mrs. Quade's got a crib and a wet nurse waiting. Mercy looks like structure if you squint. Might be you old birds can't tell the difference anymore. Structure is just fear with doors, May said. Get off my threshold. Not your threshold, Brogan reminded her, and gently tapped the wood as if to prove the barn belonged more to law than to air. Town property. Funny, May murmured. Town never sent a bill for all the calves I caught here when men were too drunk to pull. Town never offered to bury the stillborn either, but now town's got a sudden thirst to step into a woman's work. I wonder why. Mind your tone. I'm minding 2 lives, May said, and as if the line had conjured a response in the body before it found a target in the law, Riva felt the rush as her water broke, warm and unavoidable, and so relieving she laughed again, breathless. The deputies made small, embarrassed throat sounds. Oh, heaven help us, one said. She's doing exactly what women do, May cut him off. And you're doing exactly what men do when they don't know what else to do. Talk too much. Riva let the next wave roll. It owned her. She gave it her weight, and it gave back progress. She could feel the child's head pressing low, a pressure exactly wrong and exactly right at once. She widened her stance and wrapped both hands around May's forearm, not gripping to hurt, but as if the midwife were the mast and she the ship in a squall. Fen stepped where he could see without crowding. Lamp higher, he said softly, and May nodded. He raised it and made a halo where Riva could meet herself. Not her face, which had become a country she couldn't recognize, but her will, which was the oldest part of her. He didn't say, you can do this, which implied permission. He said, you are doing this, which described a fact. Sheriff Brogan tried another tactic. Riva Halden, he said, finally saying her name. You mind law now. You've had months to think. You've got hours to sleep. All the time we've been patient. We got families applying. You know the Quades lost 2 little ones. You know what it does to a woman. You make the right choice, we call it mercy, and everybody goes home with cleaner hands. Riva paused in the shudder between contractions, bracing herself on the stall door, braids damp at her neck, and turned her head just enough that her voice would carry, but not enough to give Brogan her face. I'm already home, she said, and the quiet effort struck her as being truer than she had known. And my hands are doing what they were made to do. Yours are doing what they were paid to do. May puffed out a pleased breath. There's my cliff, she said into Riva's shoulder blade. Now next one, let your mouth open. Your mouth and your hips are one hinge. The hinge smung,
and Riva felt the child move down in earnest, the way a word finally moves out of the throat after being held there for grief. Fire licked across her spine and across the top of her thighs. She moaned, low, a sound that turned the deputies into museum statues. Even the horse went still. The world turned on a small, bright point, and then that point expanded into a circle that had nothing to do with Hallowbend or any of its laws. May's hands were brisk and sure. "Good hair," she said. "Good position. Don't push until I tell you, even when your body gets greedy. You wait, you breathe, you swell around that head, and you trust me when I say you won't split like a dry board. You are not a board. You're a woman, and women aren't made in pieces that come apart easy." Riva did as she was told because the voice that gave the order came with 50 winters and the memory of 36 smell-of-lanolin babies. She breathed, hissed, breathed, and felt the ring of fire become less a terror and more a crown. The deputies shuffled, the sheriff pretended patience. Fen transitioned from lamplight to cloth to water without ever seeming to hurry. Riva understood in a way that was not at all a thought, that if the world went black, he could still find the bowl and still find her hand. "Now, Riva," May said. "Now, Riva." Riva bore down and felt the head come. It was the exact weight of the planet. It was a spoon and a star and a stone all at once. The next breath happened without her. She pushed again. She felt a slither and the slippery miracle of shoulders turning, hands clever out of sight, reality tearing itself open and then knitting as if this had always been its plan. "The head is out," May said. "Wait, wait. Oh, you patient thing, you're doing it exactly right. Now, Riva." The child slipped the rest of the way into the world and into hands waiting. And that was when the world tilted. May had set herself to catch, but at the last instant her attention flicked to a shift in Riva's color and the press of a cord where it should not press. She freed it in a swift, practiced move. In that sliver of time, the child slid like a fish through water and into Fen Moro's calms. He had already washed. His sleeves were already rolled. He did not fumble. He did not exclaim. He simply received. The first cry opened in the child like a lantern, and at its sound, men pressed forward. Brogan by habit, Pike by principle, Eleonora by hunger, the deputies by the weight of orders they did not understand. The door widened. The barn took air in as if it would choke on it. The child's cry brightened, thin and fierce as wire. "Fen," May said. Not an order, not even a request. Just his name, weighted with the years, and he knew what that meant. Not the law, not the council, not the woman with grief polished to a weapon, but the simple geometry of who owed who what. He lifted the baby and did a thing Riva had not seen a man do in Hallowbend. He set the child to Riva's chest before anyone else had time to name it. Riva curled around the small heat that was hers and felt the slick shoulders and the flailing fists and the wild, hot breath that felt older than all the men in the doorway combined. She laughed, a sound that felt like she had bitten into an apple at the exact right day. She wept because the body knows when water is necessary. She said her child's name, though no one had asked yet, though no papers had room for the way the name rose and settled in her mouth like a song. "Finnel," she whispered. "Finnel Halden." "Ma'am," Fen said softly, a warning somewhere under the courtesy. Riva looked up. Eleonora had stepped one shoe into the straw. The white of it trembled with the barn's uneven floor. Sheriff Brogan's badge flashed once and then again. Elder Pike lifted a slip of paper the way a priest lifts the host. "Our Lady Quaid has offered placement. The council has ratified. The town will witness. You need only sign." "Town will witness?" May said. "That's rich, that is." Riva's hands tightened. Finnel's mouth searched and found, and with the finding, Riva felt a great low current plug into her, as if the earth itself had offered an outlet and she had become a tower. The ache receded to a humming ache and then to a memory waiting to be named. She would have signed anything before this moment to make it come. Now that it had come, paper looked like a cheap trick. "This isn't yours," Eleonora said, And for the first time, Riva heard not arrogance, but a fracture. "I don't know what it means to—" "I know," Riva said, but not unkindly. "I know something else, too. A child is not a road that leads you back to what you lost. It's a road forward from where we stand." Eleonora's lips thinned. Sheriff Brogan took one pace forward and then another, the way men do when they want to remind you they own their legs. He said, "I'm asking you plain to do the best thing for the little one." Riva looked down at Fennel, who had already ended an argument merely by arriving. She could taste the salt of his wet hair, could hear the small, fierce gulp of his swallow. She felt the earth tilt and then level under the certainty that had walked with her for months at the edge of morning. "The best thing," she said softly, "is to leave my hands full." Sheriff Brogan reached then, not all the way, not a grab, but a man's open palm like an invitation. He said, "I'll take him for a second, just so the papers can get signed neat." Fen stepped between them, and the careful quiet he'd kept all along became a different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight. He had the child in one arm and Riva's gaze on his face, and he looked at the sheriff as if the clock's hands had been set wrong. "No," he said, and it was not a shout, but the lamp flame leaned toward his voice. Brogan's toothpick clicked against his molar. "That so?" Fen's hands were steady. "That's so." Fen, May warned, not because she disagreed, but because she knew how the wind changed when a man said a clean no to other men. "Careful." "I'm being careful," Fen said, and the care in his voice was a blade without glint. "I'm careful with glass, with time, with blood. I'll be careful with law if law remembers its job." He looked at Elder Pike. "Do you remember, Elder? Its job is to hold the weak against the strong, not to hold them down while the strong get what they want." Eleonora went very still. Sheriff Brogan's hand flexed. The deputies shifted their boots to find a better argument in the ground. The sway-backed bay moved its weight from one hip to another and blew out breath like fog. Riva realized she was grinning, feral and small at once, like a fox grins when it finally slips its paw from a trap and discovers the paw is whole. Elder Pike shook the paper as if that could reassert reality. "You are not the father," he said, and the word father hung a moment and then fell like a coin into a well. "Then it ought to be easy for you," Fen said calm. "Step aside and let the people who do have say speak for themselves." He tipped his head toward Riva without taking his eyes off the men. "Do you want me to keep holding him?" Riva had not known a question could be a lifeline. "Yes." The word came like the shred of cloth she had once wrapped around a bleeding hand, small and exactly the right size to hold everything it had to. "Then I'll keep holding him," Fen said. Eleonora's self-control cracked at last, not into tears but into a kind of brightness that made her look briefly younger and infinitely more dangerous. She breathed, "This is madness. You are not owed anything here. You misunderstand mercy for theft." Fen's gaze didn't waver. "Madam," he said softly, and in the word was a respect that was not obedience. "If mercy is clean, it doesn't need someone else's grief to shine it up." Sheriff Brogan reached for the child anyway, fast, like he might have snatched a poker from the fire. Fen stepped sideways, the movement so deft that it barely rustled the straw, and Riva saw in the same instant the exact truth May had meant when she said Fen knew the difference between an extra breath and a last one. He didn't hold the baby tighter, he held him right. He made no show of strength because strength didn't need showing. He said no, and this time the word had an edge that could cut paper without tearing it. "It's done," Elder Pike said, voice rising, calling the town to his side like a bell calls the faithful. "The council isn't the mother," May snapped. "Isn't the law," Fen added.
"Isn't God," Riva whispered. And the whisper was louder than any of them because it was said into the crown of a head that still glistened with birth and need, and the old promise behind the oldest promise. You belong where you are loved. Eleonora drew herself up. "Then we will see," she said, and something in the way she said it told Riva this would not be the last door they would have to hold shut. The deputies made a choice in that breath, the kind that paints a man's name on his own door for the rest of his days. One stepped back, the other did not. Sheriff Brogan looked at the one who had moved and filed that retreat away under debts to collect. Elder Pike tucked his paper into his coat and patted it once as if it were a tame animal. Eleonora took one pace backward, then another, already promising herself the kind of patience that makes a fence of a woman's body. "Storm's here," Fen said quietly, and then the storm answered. The sky that had been busy with all its private arguments broke. Rain slapped the roof and then settled into a steady drumming.
The sound swallowed small words and sent big ones back to their owners. Sheriff Brogan turned up his collar against it, an ironic act inside a barn with a roof. Elder Pike pinched his lips. Eleanor's lashes glittered with blown mist. "Fine," Brogan said. "Have it your way for the next hour. We'll be back when the laws had breakfast." He tipped his chin at Fen. "Then we'll see what your hands hold when they're empty." "They won't be empty," Riva said. "Not today. Not any morning you show yourself." The men left. Not with the slam of righteous stores, but with the careful economy of men who had been told no and were saving face and fury for later. The barn drafted them out like smoke. The rain took what fell from their coats. Riva's breath went ragged and then smoothed. May's hands stayed busy. Because birth is a long work even when the baby has arrived. She checked Riva's bleeding, made a tutting noise that sounded satisfied, and set about persuading the afterbirth to finish the story the body had started. Fen stood within arm's reach and yet felt further away than he had all night because he was watching every shadow the door had made as if it might reach back in and grab. Riva drifted toward sleep with her cheek on Finial's hair. She woke with his root and suck, a bright little ache that pulled her into herself and into him and into something that felt a lot like a prayer that never bothered with words. "Can you stand?" May asked, brisk and gentle, already arranging a pallet in the tack room where the walls were thicker and the door more stubborn. Riva would have said yes to any request that had to do with keeping Finial to her chest. She nodded and moved in increments, more a migration than a walk. The world looked newer and older at once. She could see the knot in the stall post that looked like a coin pressed into wood. She could smell the rain and the animal and the iron and her own milk. She could hear the town as if from underwater. The tack room door shut. The latch found its idea again and held. May set the lamp low. Fen stood with his back to the wall and his gaze on the gap at the bottom of the door. He had not yet asked to hand Finial back. He had not yet argued that the baby belonged somewhere else. He had only stood and kept his hands on what they were put to hold. Riva wanted to say thank you, but gratitude felt like a tin coin for a diamond. She said, "I named him," because that was another way of saying, "I intend for him to stay in my mouth, and my arms, and in my future." "Finial Haldon," Fen repeated, not to make it his, but to make it real. He smiled. It remade his face in an astonishing way. The tiredness went out of it. The quiet stayed. "Good name. It'll learn to walk on its own without scraping its knees." May snorted. "You two are poets now. Sleep, I'll watch." But Riva could not sleep. Not because she was afraid, though fear lay down near her feet like a dog that wouldn't do what it was told. But because a hinge inside her had swung open and there was wind behind it. She felt every change in the pressure beyond the walls. She heard shoes in mud and knew who wore them by the way they landed. She heard a bug crawling on the rafters and knew by the rhythm that it wasn't a beetle, but a slow moth. She heard a coin click against a tooth in the square and knew Sheriff Brogan was gritting his jaw. She felt the air thicken and thin as if the whole town were breathing beside her without consent. "Are you always like this?" she asked softly. "After hard nights?" "Like what?" "Like the rain could walk in if it thought to knock." Fen considered. "I live with doors open. Makes it easier to hear a cry that's not mine." Riva thought of all the doors she had been told to keep closed. She thought of what happened to a woman who left one open by accident or by design. She looked at Finial and at her own hand cupped over his back, and felt the door she had left open tonight become a thing she could defend with her body. "Thank you," she said anyway, because the tin coin still shined some. He shrugged one shoulder, and the shrug said, "I have been thanked by people who meant it less and needed it more." It said, "I don't keep a ledger." It said, "I have learned not to count what can't be stored." The first hour after dawn brought a gray light like wet wool. The second hour brought 3 women with baskets and eyes that could cut carrots. They stepped into the barn as if through a picket line and set their things down in a way that made a barricade without naming it. Elsie from the wash house. Dorothea, who made hats and could sew a sting into every brim. Beata, whose husband never spoke above a whisper, but who herself had a voice that could bend tin. They nodded to May, and looked at Riva, and then looked at Finial, and without once looking toward the door, they began to work. Bread appeared, towels appeared, a small kettle set itself to steam. The room got smaller and safer. "Good," May said. "Good girls, come sit on them baskets like hens, make clucking sounds if a deputy tries to come in." Dorothea cackled and moved to stand where her hips made the doorway narrower. "I can do meek after lunch, not before." Elsie set a bone-handled knife within easy reach and did not explain it. Beata took off her wedding ring and put it in her pocket because the band had begun to pinch, and because a woman who needed to gesture didn't need to worry about bleeding. Riva felt something unclench. It wasn't peace. It wasn't victory. It was room. The men returned on the third hour. They were different. Not many in number. Sheriff Brogan, Elder Pike, 2 different deputies, and a man that Riva had not seen before. He wore city boots and the kind of coat that knew the inside of offices. He had scrips of paper tucked like wives where a countryman would tuck tobacco. "Good morning," he said to the barn at large. "I'm Advocate Birch, Circuit Solicitor. I've been asked to solve a domestic matter of some sensitivity." May wiped her hands on her apron and did not approach. "I've been asked to catch a child without the state's hands on its ankles, and I have. Sensitivity's done for the day." Birch smiled as if he had just discovered something he had already decided he wouldn't like. "Ah, you're the midwife. I am the weather when you don't pack a coat. Move on." Birch ignored her the way a man ignores a gust while lighting a cigar. He looked toward the tack room, and then at Sheriff Brogan. "Mother and baby?"
Brogan nodded toward the door, but hesitated, because there were women between him and it. Beata tilted her chin in a way that asked him to say please. He didn't. He pushed. Dorothea stiffened and did not move. Elsie slid her knife closer to her knee. "Let me talk to her," Birch said, easing from law to honey. "Alone." "No," May said. "She's not alone anymore. It's important that she feel free to speak. Freedom isn't what you get when a man stands on your only way out," May answered. Riva heard it all through the wood the way you hear a storm coming through a frame. Her body obeyed the old commands of nursing: hold, adjust, release. Fennel slept the way brand new things sleep, with sudden full-body sighs that feel like secrets going back into the world where they were made. Fenn stood on the far side of the tack room and made of his posture a shoreline that let waves arrive without letting them claim the land. "Riva Halden?" Birch called. "Miss Halden, I'm not here to hurt you." "No," Riva answered, and was surprised by the mildness in her own voice. "Then you're spare. I've got enough of not hurting." "I think you misunderstand my role," Birch said, moving a little closer to the door as if proximity could prove gentleness. "The council simply wishes to ensure the child is positioned for success. Mrs. Quaid is prepared to offer a stipend, education, a future." Riva felt the old anger rise, not as a flame this time, but as a tide. It lifted her words. "I have a future. He has one too. It begins here." "Spoken like a mother," Birch said, and the compliment had teeth. "But motherhood is more than sentiment. It is provision. Provision is more than coin. It is sleep and safety, and truth without price." Birch's smile tightened. "Admirable. Insufficient." May made a sound like a stove lid settling. "You say that to the wrong woman, and you'll be picking your teeth out of your lip with tweezers." Sheriff Brogan shifted his weight as if eager to make the talk end with something his hands understood. Elder Pike folded his hands over his stomach and looked like a chapter heading. Advocate Birch's gaze flickered to Fenn and returned. "You," he said, "are not family." Fenn shrugged. "Sometimes the people who stand still when the floor tilts end up being family." Birch tapped his papers against his palm. "You have no claim." Fenn's eyes softened, something Riva had not expected in this moment.
and he looked across at Fennel with a kind of amazement that made the room wider by a fraction. "He has one on me," he said simply. Riva did not know how to carry what those words put into her hands, so she did what she could. She held Fennel, and she held her breath, and she held the line inside herself where she didn't waver. The tin brooch was warm against her skin. She touched it and felt her mother's fingers, felt the road from Poppy Hollow unroll under her feet again, felt the promise between her teeth shift from future tense to present. "Bridge is this," Dorothea announced from the other side of the door, in the tone of a woman who has decided to become a problem. "If any man sets a foot across this fill without the mother saying, 'Come in,' we put his foot back on the other side with a hammer." Advocate Birch took a breath that was meant to look patient and wound up thin. "Enough theater." He lifted a paper so words could cast shadow on his own chin. "By the power vested in me, I declare that the welfare of the infant called Fennel Halden is to be judged by the people who have held him since he breathed, which ain't you, is to be weighed against the liabilities of the mother's position, standing upright on the ground she bled on, and the opportunities afforded by the Quaid estate, which can't buy back the dead, and therefore temporary custody." Birch drove, finding a place in the sentence where he could set his stake. Fenn moved. He did not lunge. He stepped. He opened the tackroom door with the care a man gives a music box whose spring has wound tight, and he stood in the doorway with a child asleep on Riva's chest. He looked like the kind of man who had been born at a crossroads and had decided to build his house there so people who needed water could find a bucket. He glanced at Riva, and then at May, and then at the women in the doorway, and when he looked at Birch, there was a question in his eyes, and an answer already behind it. "What if," Fenn asked, and he asked it as if talking to the kind of man who listens to possibilities before he rejects them, "instead of forcing your paper through a door, you step aside and let a mother walk out of this barn with her child? And if you want a witness to her good sense and her good care, I'll be that witness. If you want a guarantor on the promise she already made, I'll put my name beside hers. If you want a man to say he'll keep standing where he stood last night until this town learns which way mercy leans, I'll say it now." Birch blinked. Men like him rarely encountered a proposal that wasn't also a trap. He looked at Sheriff Brogan for help and got the kind of shrug men give when their toothpick breaks. Elder Pike cleared his throat as if syllables could be deployed like troops. Eleanora Quaid was not there to glint, but her absence felt like a coiled thing at the edge of the straw. Fennel breathed. The rain steadied. "No," Birch said. "No, I don't think so. Hallowbend will not be embarrassed by a precedent. The council will not be seen to yield," Fenn supplied gently, "to decency." Advocate Birch's face went pale and then blotched. "Deputy, do your duty." The deputy, who had not yet spoken, moved, not backward, forward. He was young, and his boots said he had not walked far enough to earn their creases. His hand went toward his belt, not to his gun, but to the little leather pouch at the back, the one men use when they think logistics will fix whatever the heart has broken. He had a loop of cord there and a set of cuffs so shiny they reflected the barn's one lamp and made a little sun. Riva felt her body turn iron under the thin skin of exhaustion. May shifted her stance, old bones set on old principles. The women leaned in as if pressed by wind. Elder Pike lifted his chin in the way of a man who can almost hear a hymn. "Stop," Fenn said, and this time he did not say it softly. The deputy didn't. He took another step. He had his eyes on the cord as if the act of untying it would carry him through the rest of the day with clean hands. He did not look at Fennel. He did not look at Riva. He did not look at the way the world was currently balancing on the edge of a knife that could cut all of them. Fenn shifted the baby into the crook of Riva's elbow and stepped forward. He put his hand on the deputy's wrist, not hard, not in a way that flexed power, but in a way that made the wrist remember it belonged to a man made of bone and blood and not paper. "Stop," he said again, and the word went through the deputy and uncled itself to his shoulder and told the sinew there to pay attention. The deputy looked up for the first time. He saw a man whose eyes did not advertise their hurt, and a woman whose mouth had been set by work older than the badge on his chest, and a child who had nothing but the next breath yet, and in that instant he could have backed away and become the sort of man who tells the story later with relief in it. He didn't. He jerked his arm out of Fenn's grip and swung the cuffs up and outward in one smooth, practiced arc. The metal caught Fenn across the brow, not hard enough to drop him, but hard enough to paint a bright streak of red above his eye. He blinked once. The deputy swung again, this time with less training and more fear. The cuff flashed in the lamplight. Fenn ducked and the cuff clanged against the stall post, ringing like a small, ugly bell. Finnell startled and wailed, the sound so pure and abrupt it made Birch's papers quiver in his hands. Riva stood without thinking, her body still heavy and raw, and every animal part of her that had learned the word mother woke up and stood up with her. Sheriff Brogan drew his gun. He didn't aim yet. He held it low, the way a man does when he wants to show he's above aiming, but not above shooting. May threw her arm wide and made of her sleeve a shield. Dorothea reached for the hammer that wasn't there and grabbed a ladle instead and looked prepared to make it famous. Elsie's knife glinted. Beata's voice found a note that died in tin and kept going in bone. Elder Pike began a prayer with the wrong first word. Fenn lifted his hands to show they were empty, though they weren't entirely. The baby's weight still warmed the air around him. He looked at Riva, and in that look was an unspoken question he had not had to ask until now. "Do I keep holding your child while the law tries to take your child?" Riva nodded, and she did not nod like a supplicant. She nodded like a hinge closing with purpose. "Yes," she said, and the word rang the space inside her as if her rib cage were a bell. "Keep holding him." Fenn turned back to the men. Blood trickled down into his eyebrow and made his eye want to close. He kept it open. He spoke to the one person in the barn who might still be reachable by language. "Advocate," he said to Birch, "if there is a law that permits this, it is a law made for theft." Birch swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed like a boy caught with his hand in the sugar. "Deputy," he said again, thinner. The deputy lunged. Fenn didn't step back. He stepped forward and caught the deputy's coat near the shoulder seam, where a year of wear had made the stitching soft. He didn't strike. He didn't shove. He didn't make a shape of victory. He made a shape of refusal, a man standing with his body between a child and a harm, saying with his bones what words cannot carry without breaking. The deputy twisted, the cuff tore free and clattered to the dirt. Sheriff Brogan's gun hand rose a fraction. "Don't," Riva said to the sheriff, and the word turned the air into the thing that might kill or might carry them. "Don't." Sheriff Brogan's mouth went into the shape men make when they think a woman has confused courage with begging. "Ma'am," he said, and tilted the gun until its mouth addressed the ground again, because for all his meanness, he was no fool, and a shot fired in a barn with women braced like beams would not end any way he could sell as clean. "Get that man out of my way." "No," Fenn said a third time, and in the third no was the first thing like anger Riva had heard from him. "I didn't catch this child to deliver him into hands that don't know how to hold." Advocate Birch's skin had gone the color of wet paper. He looked at his colleagues and saw there no patience left, only the wish for this moment to be over and written down in a way that favored them. He lifted his pen like a surrender flag and made a mark on a line that wasn't meant for him. "Temporary custody to the council pending." The door behind him blew open and slapped the wall. Rain and daylight came in together. The doorway filled with shadows, then resolved into shapes Riva hadn't expected. Men from the edge of town, whose faces were cracked by wind more than by worry. Women from the washhouse who weren't supposed to be on this shift. Mill Baines, who had a limp that made stairs a sermon and still climbed the barn steps 2 at a time. Word had moved as if carried by its own legs. The square was full, the street behind it further full. Hallow Bend had come to see what a woman would do when asked to give up her child at the moment he learned to cry. What she did was simple. She handed the baby to the man who had refused to hand him away. She put both of her hands flat against Fenmoro's chest and looked over his shoulder at the law with the steady, bright gaze of someone who understands exactly how thin the plank is between her and the drop and chooses to cross anyway. "Try it," she said to the room that had become too small to hold it all. "Try it to take him." The deputy who had swung the cuffs hesitated exactly long enough to learn his lesson and not long enough to keep from doing something stupid. He lunged a second time, fast, reaching not for the baby now but for the mother, because even a fool knows that if you grab the root, the branches will follow. Fen's hand shot out and caught the deputy's wrist mid-air. The slap of skin against skin made the sound like thunder finding the mountains. The barn held its breath. And Fenmoro, eyes bright with blood and rain, said in a voice that would not fit back into any law book after this, "No, he stays." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. He stays. The word hung in the barn with weight enough to bend the nail heads. It echoed off the rafters and found a home in the hollows above the stalls, then slid down the slats and stood between Fenmoro's body and the deputy's lifted hand, like a fourth shoulder. Riva felt it land in her chest as if someone had set a warm stone on her sternum to keep her heart from flying out. The baby answered the word the only way a brand new thing can, by searching, by finding, by fastening. Fennel's mouth made its quiet work and drew the world small and safe around the place where they touched. The deputy's breath made a sound like a man who had run farther than he'd meant to. He stared at Fen as if hoping he might turn into paper after all. Sheriff Brogan's gun hung low, but no law in the world could make a drawn weapon look harmless in a place that smelled of milk and straw and the iron tang of blood already counted for and blessed. Elder Pike's lips moved without sound around a liturgy that had lost its pews. Advocate Birch held his papers as if they were a raft and the barn a flood he had not seen coming. Outside, the rain steadied, a wide hand smoothing an unruly head. The crowd in the square pressed closer to the open doors and then stopped, sensing that if too many bodies pushed, something would break that words could not repair. The women at the threshold, Elsie with her knife, Dorothea with her ladle like a mace, Beata with her squared shoulders and bare ring finger, leaned into one another without moving their feet. May Kettle's mouth went thinner than a thread and just as strong. Riva breathed, because May's hand on her back told her to. She breathed because everything in the room that had learned to live on breath steadied when she did. She breathed, and the ache in her belly eased from sharp to sure. She breathed, and the ache in her heart learned the shape of the word stayed. "Deputy," Birch tried again, paper thin, the syllables wrinkling on the way out of his mouth. "Proceed." "No," Fen said once more, and there was light under the no. Not rage, not threat. Light the way a window lit under a storm makes its own small weather. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't take his eyes off the deputy's face. He didn't widen his stance. He simply did not move, and the not moving made a wall. Sheriff Brogan cocked his head, one part curiosity, two parts contempt. "You thinking to get yourself shot over somebody else's baby, stranger?" Fen's mouth ticked at one corner, as if he'd heard a joke told badly. "I'm thinking you ought to remember that every person in this town can see you, and that they remember better when the truth smells like gunpowder." Elder Pike found his voice. "This is scandal. This is rebellion." He pinched his collar as if tightening it would strangle disobedience out of the air. "We have a structure." "We have a child," May said. "Structure can fetch water for once." Fennel's mouth made its quiet work and drew the world small and safe around the place where they touched. In the motion she felt a new soreness and an old strength. She looked up and found Fen's profile made of the same stubborn line as the roof beam behind him, the line that holds when the snow gets heavy. "Listen," Dorothea said, "to nobody and everybody. You can hear the town thinking." It was true. Riva could hear it the way she had heard the beetle and the moth before, the crowded silence where thought rubs on thought and makes a heat that can become courage or turn to ash.
In that silence, a man coughed outside and stepped forward with his hat in his hands. It was Mill Baines, each stare conquered and each breath accounted for. "Sheriff," he called, the word blowing up dust it had not meant to. "Leave it. We've all had enough taking." Sheriff Brogan didn't look at Mill. Men like him do not turn toward what pricks if they can help it. He rolled the toothpick against his teeth and addressed Fenn instead. "You know what a jail looks like in this town?" Fenn considered. Like a place that sometimes gets things wrong. Like a place that can hold a man whose hands don't know how to mind their own business. "Stronger hands than mine have unlearned worse habits," Fenn said, "and I've learned not to let go of what belongs to the people it belongs to." He flicked a glance toward Riva, and the glance had a question folded inside it again. The same question as before, the same answer waiting. She gave it with a nod so small only May would have seen it if she had not already been looking the same way. "Enough," Advocate Birch snapped at last, his smooth thinning away until there was only the wire under it. He lifted his pen and jabbed its nib toward the straw. "Deputy." "To what?" May cut in, startling even herself with the crispness of the sentence. "I told you I sell opinions after sunup. It is now sunup, and I say my price is you stepping back 3 paces and recalling that I am older than your law and I will outlast your paper." Laughter moved through the doorway like a ripple through wheat. Not derision, but relief riding on someone else's courage long enough to touch their own. The deputy, who had been hovering on the cusp between obedience and sense, chose obedience the way a boy chooses a dare because eyes are on him. He lunged again, quicker than before, but not wise, angling not for baby or mother this time, but for the man who had become an insult just by standing still. Fenn caught him. He didn't punch. He didn't even squeeze. He wrapped his fingers around the deputy's forearm and pressed his thumb to the place where pulse argues with panic. He said stop again, his voice finding a lower floor, and something in the word reminded the young man that he had once stood on a riverbank and decided not to swim because the current was too strong. He stopped. Elder Pike made a sound like a kettle being moved off a boil before company. "This is lawlessness. This is anarchy." "This is a woman who has not slept since yesterday," Dorothea replied, "and a baby's whose skull is still finding out it's not a moon. Big word, anarchy. Split it up and see if you can swallow it." A new voice cut the debate clean, unspooling from the square with cold control and practiced cadence. "Enough of this barnyard parliament." Eleanor Quaid stepped into view but not into straw, stopping at the threshold like water stops at the lip of a cup it wants to fill but does not dare. She had changed clothes. The black silk of her morning dress made the rain look like ash on the stove it did not own. Her face was a still lake with a storm under it. "Sheriff, collect the child." "No," Riva said, surprising herself by being calm. "No, Mrs. Quaid." Eleanor's gaze found Riva's and held, and what Riva had taken for hunger earlier now looked like thirst. "I will not argue in a stable. I will not be shouted down by hens with kitchen knives. I am not your villain." "Then don't act like it," May said, and if anyone else had said it, the words might have turned into splinters in their mouth. From May they made a fence you could see and decide whether to climb or not. Eleanor's eyes flicked to Fennel and back. "You have no idea what it is to wake to quiet that never ends," she said to Riva, the top layer cracking. "To sit in a room with 2 empty cradles and hear only your own breath until you want to break the window just to let a bird in and have something to shoo." She swallowed the next words with visible effort and smoothed her gloves as if they were horses that had spooked. "I am not your villain," she repeated, softer. "I am what your town has decided mercy looks like this week." Riva's throat ached with something that was not labor and not law. "I am sorry for your empty, truly, but you are trying to fill it with what is not yours." Eleanor flinched as if Riva had slapped her. She turned to Advocate Birch and found there no new weapon, only paper gone limp in the rain. She turned to Brogan and found there only a man whose dislike of being defied had begun to outweigh even his desire to win. She turned back to Riva. "This isn't over," she said, and made it a promise to herself rather than a threat to the others. "No," Fenn agreed, "it isn't." For a moment the room balanced. A woman with a baby, a man with blood under his eyebrow and steadiness under his blood, a midwife whose hands had learned to make rooms where none stood, 3 women who had decided to be furniture you could not tilt, a sheriff with a gun he had not fired, a council elder with a collar that choked and justified in equal measure, a lawyer with dry paper and wet pride. The town pressed on the edges.
curious and careful.
And then the balance broke, not from a shot or a shout, but from a decision as simple as a step. "Let's move," May said. "We won't deliver this child a second time to the same threshold. Tack room's done its duty. We take her to the boarding house, close the door, draw the shades, and we make the world knock instead of barge." "Walk her through the square?" Brogan scoffed. "You want theater?" "I want daylight," May said. "I want the people who pay your salary to see what your badge is for." Dorothea's chin pointed toward the rain. "We can make a lane." "Hold your line," Beata told the crowd. "If a man in a hat you don't love tries to cut through, trip him." Elsie slid the bone-handled knife into her basket and looped her arm through Riva's. "We go when you breathe out, not when they say so." Riva looked to Finnell, then to Fen, then to May. She imagined stepping into the square, the rain wetting the baby's hair, the eyes on her like hands that could stroke or strike. She imagined the boarding house stairs and Mrs. Deemer's mouth a tight coin slot of worry. She imagined the door closing on the town and opening on the long work ahead, feeding, changing, filing, fighting, loving, sleeping in pieces that made a whole anyway. The thought did not frighten her. It simply asked her to stand up. "Now," she said, and the barn moved. Fen turned sideways to shelter the baby from the door's edge as they passed. May snapped orders like someone snapping kindling. "Dorothea, ahead. Beata, left shoulder. Elsie, right. Mill, your arm if she needs a step steady. Fen—" "I know," he said. "I won't let go." They stepped into the rain. It was not heavy. It was not light. It was the kind of rain that taught the dust a lesson and left it more humble, the kind that made the street smell clean without pretending it was. People parted because the human body knows how to make way for a woman carrying the center of the world. Hats tilted, mouths softened. Riva heard her name ushered along as if it had grown new syllables. She kept her gaze low and forward, not in shame, but in precision. May's hand on her back remained, a compass needle pointing home. Sheriff Brogan walked on the right and did not reach for anyone. Elder Pike walked on the left and did not bless anyone. Advocate Birch had fallen back, the way a man does when he discovers the road he thought he owned is in fact a path through people. Eleanor Quaid had vanished into the square's shadows and reappeared 30 paces ahead, as if she meant to be present at the end of a thing she could not control. The boarding house door opened as if at a cue no one had given aloud. Mrs. Deemer stood back and made the doorway larger by sheer force of will. "Well then," she said, bones squared, "bring your rein in and make the floors pay attention." They crossed the threshold, and the town relaxed a notch, the way a field relaxes when the herd moves off. Riva climbed the stairs she knew by squeak and pause, Finnell's weight a counter to each step's complaint. Fen stayed level with her, hands ready but not hovering. May followed, counting under her breath. Not stairs, not steps, not contractions now, but some invisible measure that told her how far a woman could go before she must sit. In the room the lamp made a low gold, and the quilt lay turned back from a pillow that held the exact faint hollow of Riva's head from yesterday. The tin brooch was still warm against her chest. She lay down and felt the mattress embrace her exhaustion without asking for anything in return. Finnell settled along the curve of her arm. Fen stood with his hands on the back of the chair, and for the first time since last night, his shoulders dropped. "Door," May said. Mrs. Deemer shut it. The latch found itself again and held. The wet murmurs of the square receded to the noise of cooking and commerce. "You did it," Elsie whispered, as if Riva had crossed a river and come out on a bank nobody else had found yet. "For now," Riva said, and the words did not take away from the victory. They simply set it on the shelf where it belonged, among the plates you use every day and wash every night.
May blew out a long breath and pushed a wisp of hair back with a wrist that had caught more babies than Pike had sermons. Now we eat, and we file, and we think ahead while we let your body think of itself. File? Riva asked, eyelids leafing low. Paper, May said, making the word sound like a rowboat. Birthbook. Name written in a hand that doesn't shake. We make it look official enough to remind fools that you were always official. She looked at Fen. You fetch water and the clerk. Fell? Fen asked. He's honest when he's sober. He's honest when his mother-in-law looks at him, May said. Bring both. Fen's mouth made that almost smile again and then straightened. Eleonora will try something else. She won't step away. I know, May said. Let her try. We'll be busy making right look boring. Riva drifted, not to sleep, not yet, but to that narrow place at the edge of it where day makes promises the body believes. Her mind made a list without words. Feed, file, wash, watch, rest, repeat. The list soothed her the way shelling peas had soothed her when the world was otherwise full of noise, useful, rhythmic, green. Fen returned with water before he returned with anyone else. He set it where May pointed and did not spill. He stepped back to the chair and stood with one palm on its back, as if furniture felt steadier when someone accountable touched it. Clerk's coming, he said, with his mother-in-law. Mrs. Deemer snorted. So God answers some prayers right quick. There was a knock. Not the kind of knock that owned doors, but the kind that asked. Enter, May called. Fell edged in, hat in his hands, a mother-in-law at his shoulder and common sense newly laundered in his eyes. I don't do house calls, Fell said automatically. His mother-in-law said nothing, but watched him with the eyes of a falcon that has stopped pretending to be a songbird. Except when the town needs me to, he amended. May produced a ledger with a cracked spine and a ribbon that had been read when Polk was president. Right, she said. Do it neat. Fell sat at the little table under the window and squared the book, then squared the pen, then squared his shoulders until his mother-in-law's fingers brushed his sleeve and reminded him not to waste the room's patience. He bent and wrote. The nib made a spider's quiet progress. Riva listened to the scratch and let it set her breathing. Name, date, hour. The pen paused at father. Fell did not look up. He drew a line through the blank like rivers draw their own banks when men cannot agree on where they belong. Witness, Fell said, and leaned aside. I'll sign, May said, and made her name a thing you could climb. And the boarding house. Mrs. Deemer signed, her letters neat as bread slices. Fell glanced up, pen hovering. Another, he said, because something in him knew that a name from a man who had bled for this room would make paper hold straighter. Fen hesitated a heartbeat and then bent. He wrote Fen Morrow in a hand that had learned to draw straight lines on swaying decks and trembling tables. He did not look at what he wrote after he wrote it, as if to check would be to question the truth. Fell sanded the ink, blew carefully, shut the book on its ribbon, and stood. His mother-in-law took the ledger from him the way a woman lifts a casserole out of a man's hands when she knows he's holding it too low. Done, she said. Done enough to make a fuss if someone tries to pretend it wasn't. Thank you, Riva whispered. Fell tipped his hat in a way that made his mother-in-law roll her eyes with love. I can be brave when a room of women makes it feel safe, he said, and left before his courage got spotted by men who'd mock it. For a while, the room was small again. Mrs. Deemer fetched broth. Elsie washed the basin. Dorothea slept sitting up with her arms crossed, mouth open like a pouting saint. Beata unfolded and refolded diapers as if shuffling a deck that would always deal the same good card. May's hands never stopped doing little things whose sum was comfort. Fen watched the door the way a Coast Guard watches the line where dark water turns brighter, not because anything is there now, but because a thing that wants to come will not warn when it does. The knock when it came was firm and businesslike. May lifted her chin. "Come." Eleanor Quaid entered, alone. She had taken off the gloves. She held no paper. Riva's throat tightened, not for fear, not for anger, but with the complicated ache that happens when two women find themselves on a floor made of a man's decisions and have to walk without tripping over each other. "Mrs. Quaid," May said, formal, without frost. Eleanor's gaze did not go to May, it did not go to Fen, it did not go to the ledger on the table or the Reen in the window. It went to Riva and stayed there. She took 3 steps forward and stopped far enough away that no one could confuse looking with looming. She said, "I want to see him." The words were brisk to hide whatever else they carried. Riva tightened the blanket without thinking. "You can look." Eleanor looked, for a long time. Long enough that May smoothed her apron 3 times and Fen's hand closed around the back of the chair once, slow as if counting. Eleanor's face folded in on itself and then smoothed. When she spoke, she sounded like someone trying to teach herself the difference between holding and having. "He looks like every baby," she said, surprise and grief braided. "And he looks like—" She couldn't finish. "A future," Riva offered, "because some words do need hands to carry them." Eleanor blinked. She stood straighter. "I have no right to ask you anything," she said, "and if I had, I have lost it by the means I used to come here. Still, I will ask something." Her jaw set around the word please, the way a gate clicks shut on a post it did not choose. "When you take him out, will you—" She faltered and tried again in a voice made younger by asking, "Will you pass by my street once, just once, so I can stand at my window and know I saw him in daylight and not in the corner of a barn or in the shadow of a law?" Riva felt her heart knock in her throat with the impacts of many things: anger at the audacity, pity for the loss, recognition that grief makes thieves, gratitude that this woman had come without paper to make a human request. She looked at May. May did not nod or shake her head. She looked at Fen. Fen did not lift a brow. He held Riva's gaze as if to say, "I will stand where you stand." "Yes," Riva said finally, because the world needed as many mercies thrown ahead of it as it could get. "I will pass." Eleanor did not smile. Smiles were too spendy for this hour. She bowed her head once precisely and left with the same exactness with which she had entered. "Woman's building a bridge with sorched wood," May muttered. "Still, a bridge." Riva rested. She slept, finally. She woke to Finnell's hunger and the light changed by a hand on the shade. She ate a heel of bread and a sound found her, a small humming she could not remember having learned and yet knew perfectly. The humming lived in her chest and moved through her bones and told the room what it already believed, that she was mother. Afternoon found them like this: Riva upright, Finnell tossy with milk, May counting stitches, Elsie off to her wash-house, Dorothea dragged home by her sister for a nap she pretended not to need, Beata tapping her foot to a song no one else could hear, Mrs. Deemer making a stew that would be water and salt and love and still taste grand, Fen at the door. It found the town like this: men arguing softly so their wives would not hear how little their arguments mattered, boys running messages that amounted to "we are watching something we might tell our grandsons," women placing chairs on porches as if expecting a parade. It found the law like this: Sheriff Brogan irritated down to the thread ends, Elder Pike drafting sentences so long they might last until election, Advocate Birch redrafting what he had drafted and discovering that paper did not grow spines merely because a man wanted it to. The second knock was not a knock, it was a boot on a stair that did not squeak because the man wearing it had had a boy run ahead with a piece of soap to knead into the crack. Fen heard the absence of the squeak and turned his head. The door opened before Mace had come because some men are built of coming in. "Mrs. Quaid," May said, her voice one notch cooler. "Judge Uriah, I was wondering when you'd insert your spine into other people's business." Judge Uriah Aarons filled doorways where he walked, not with muscle, with certainty. He brought with him the smell of a desk that never sees sunlight and a pipe that tastes like arguments. He carried nothing in his hands because men like Aarons prefer to have their weapons in their mouths. "Miss Kettle," Aarons said with courtesy that was a lid on a pot. "Mrs. Deemer, Miss Holden," his eyes found Finnell and narrowed as if looking at a star and trying to decide how much of it to legislate. "I have issued an order." He said it the way men say, "I have shot a deer." "We issued a baby," May replied. Ours beats yours." Aaron smiled without moving his cheeks. "The council's concern for the infant's welfare is not an insult to yours, Miss Kettle. It is an addition. Like a brick on a chest, you can call it a blanket if you're cruel." Aaron's held out a folded paper he had not appeared to be carrying, the way a conjurer shows a rabbit where there was no hat. Fen did not reach for it, May did not reach for it. Riva looked at it and felt a wind begin under her ribs again. "Temporary custody to Hallow Bend," Aaron's announced. "Pending hearings and the proper revelations of paternity and support. Sheriff." Brogan moved out of the shadow behind him like a truth come at last, when you had been dreading it. He did not draw his gun, he did not need to. Law, done shamelessly, is its own weapon. He reached for the baby. Fen did not tighten his grip first. He lifted Fennel and set him back into Riva's arms as if he were a compass returning to true. Then he turned and faced the sheriff. "No," he said. Aaron sighed as if someone had asked him to taste stew he had already decided to dislike. "It will go worse for you if you persist," he told Fen. "Obstruction, assault, perhaps kidnapping if you remove the child from town lines." "Worse than what?" Fen asked. There was no sarcasm in the words, only a request for clarity from a man who had learned that vague threats were often warnings to the wrong person. "Worse than a child taken from the person who bled for him this morning. Worse than a town that thinks its structures are kinder than a woman's hands. Worse than the consequences of thinking your personal righteousness outweighs civic design," Aaron said. He turned his head toward Riva. "Miss Halden, I am sorry for your circumstances, but you must agree that a child needs more than the woman who made him from bread and blood?" Riva asked. "I don't agree." She did not raise her voice, she did not weep, she did not ask. She told the truth as she knew it. He needs a town that will not mistake a full pantry for a full heart. He needs a law that will not call itself merciful while it takes. Aaron's face went thoughtful the way a statue does, deep without motion. "You are eloquent," he said, "but eloquence seldom wins against appetite." "Appetite," May said, "ought to have a plate with its name on it, not eat off other people's." "Sheriff," Aaron said again, and this time Brogan stepped forward without any fussing about whose eyes were watching. He reached fast, Fen moved faster. The chair caught Brogan's shin and made him swear in a way that would get a child slapped at supper. Fen had not thrown the chair. He had moved it with the foot that is meant to keep time when a man plays the fiddle. The sheriff stumbled and his hand went not up for balance but down for gun. "Don't," May and Riva and Mrs. Deemer and Beata said at once, and the chorus had so many years in it that the sheriff's hand obeyed without telling his pride first. Aaron's mouth thinned. Enough theater, deputy. But the deputy he would have called was not in the hall. He was at the foot of the stairs arguing with 3 washwomen who had never lost an argument conducted within arm's reach of a washtub. The judge realized this a blink too late. Fen reached and took the paper from Aaron's hand. He did not tear it, he did not crumple it, he held it up to the window and let the light move through it, as if he could find out what the law was made of by how it received the day. He read, he looked at the signature, he nodded to himself once the way a carpenter nods at a beam he does not like, but must allow. "No," he said, very softly, "this is not a thing that will touch this room today." He set the paper down on the table with the ledger and the cooled bowl of broth and the little stack of folded cotton squares that would become Fennel's afternoon. He placed it carefully between bread and birth and dared it to outweigh either. Arends took a step forward. Fen took half of one. They were not 2 young men in a yard behind a saloon. They were the 2 oldest arguments the world knows. The judge lifted his chin and summoned with it the memory of gallows that had once been raised in the square for other kinds of order. "Sheriff," he said for the 3rd time. Brogan moved. He moved the way men move who have broken strong horses. Quick, decisive, relying on hands to finish what minds have refused to consider fully. He lunged not toward Riva now, not toward Fennel, but toward Fen, because he had done the math badly and decided that if he removed the hinge, the door would open itself. Fen stepped into him, and the 2 men met the way storms meet ridges, with impact and noise and pieces tumbling. The chair went over. The ledger skidded. The bowl of broth slid to the floor and spread into a small, savory lake. Riva cried out without meaning to, Fennel startled. May's hand flew to Riva's shoulder and made an anchor where none had existed a breath before. Brogan's elbow found Fen's ribs. Fen's hand found Brogan's wrist. The gun was there. The gun was always there, in a room where men believed in it. It came out of the holster in a way that would have gone faster if the owner had not been thinking of his pride. "No!" Riva's shout cracked something small and important in the room. "No guns near him." Fen heard her. He did not try to hold the gun and wrestle the man who owned it. He used the hand that held the man to slam that hand, gun and all, into the doorframe. Wood bit flesh. The gun clattered. Mrs. Deemer stepped on it without looking, and did not move her foot when it tried to wriggle out like a live thing. Arends went white and then red. "This is—" "To a birth room," May hissed. "Take your outrage to the porch." The hallway beyond their door filled with people the way a creek fills with leaves in a gust. Not all helpful, not all hindrance. A tide. Judge Arends understood tides only in the way that men in offices do, as inconveniences to calendar and ink. He backed one step and found his heels meeting a broom. Mrs. Deemer's mother-in-law, whose name was Lydia and whose opinion on nearly everyone had been reasonably correct since the Mexican War, lifted the broom in such a way that the judge found himself considering climate change. "Out," Lydia said, "or I sweep you." Arends bristled. "Madam." "Judge," Lydia returned, with the exact coolness he had used on May. "You will not like the way I sweep." He did not go. Men like him do not go before they have tried something else that will let them tell themselves they left for their own reasons. He looked at Brogan and found the sheriff rubbing his wrist and looking at a stain on his sleeve as if trying to decide whether to call it soup or blood. He looked at Fen, whose chest rose and fell with labor that was not labor, but had learned its timing from women. He looked at Riva, whose face had steadied into something that would make a man think twice before laying hands on her again. He looked at Fennel, whose mouth had resumed its life's work with a determination you could use to light a lamp. "Tomorrow," Arends said, 9 o'clock, courthouse steps. The council will be there. The law will be there. If you are not, a warrant will be issued, and I will send men to collect not just the child, but anyone who stood between the child and the town. He allowed himself one small smile. "We shall see how bravely you hold paper in daylight." "Fine," May said. "Daylight's honest." Arends left, dignity tucked around him like a cloak no one else could see. Brogan followed with a last look that promised nothing good. The hall exhaled. Lydia lifted her broom, satisfied to have moved weather with a stick. Silence made itself at home again, not deep, not complete, a room full of breathing and stew and circular worry. "We go," May said. "Down Pike Street, past the Quaid house like he promised, slow. We let the town count us. We let the town ask itself what it wants to be tomorrow." She looked at Fen. "Ready to say no again?" Fen's mouth did that near smile that had started to feel like a candle lighting without fuss. "I can say it in my sleep." Riva stood, not because she should, but because she could. Her body informed her of the cost and then offered change. She wrapped Fennel snug and pulled her shawl close and tucked the brooch where the shawl crossed, as if it were a pin and a prayer both. They walked. Down the stairs, through the door, into air rinsed by rain. The street had arranged itself the way a congregation does when the sermon grows legs. Chairs dragged, hems lifted, chins up, mouths set. Riva saw faces she had not learned yet, and faces she loved in the way you love the woman who passed you a needle in a hard winter. She saw Eleanora Quaid in a window, upright and unblinking. She saw Judge Arends on the courthouse steps, hands behind his back in the posture of a man imagining his portrait. She saw Sheriff Brogan at the corner, like a dog at a butcher's, waiting for scraps of power. Riva walked and the town widened until it could fit itself around her without pinching. Fen walked and the path remembered a footprint that did not push to be first and did not fall back to be safe. May walked and the ground decided it would be dirt and plank, and something like holy for a while. At the Quaid house, Riva stopped. She lifted Fennel enough that any eye at any window would not be able to pretend it had not seen him. She did not wave. She did not smile. She did not soften. She held the moment up the way a midwife's hands hold a new head for the mother to see, just long enough to make it stay in memory forever. Then she lowered him and walked on. A horse spooked near the blacksmith's, nothing more dramatic than a lightning-struck idea in its skittish brain. It reared, and the boy holding it lost his grip because his palms were the age where everything is sweat. The horse came down too quick and too close, iron shoes churning water into knives. Fen moved first, because he was nearest, and because his body had learned to lay itself down under falling things before his mind could suggest caution. He caught the bridle. The horse's hot breath sprayed his cheek, and he talked to it in a language that had no words, and it worked anyway. Riva stepped backward into May as the iron found puddle, not baby, and Riva laughed once, an exhausted bark, at the petty cleverness of fate. Then someone shouted, "Now!" and Riva understood that the horse had not been the danger at all. Hands, more than one, came from the side where eyes do not expect because politeness lives there. They did not go for Finnell, they went for Riva's arms, because men had learned what the deputy had learned: grab the root. The grip was not bone-breaking, it was smooth and practiced and favored by men who liked to walk away calling themselves efficient. The hands lifted and turned, and in the turn Riva felt her body go away it did not want to go. "Fen," she said, not loud, the way you say a name when the name itself is door and lever. Fen was already moving because the men who held her miscounted who else belonged to her. He came like a man toward a mantel clock that had stopped 10 seconds short of letting the town know the hour it was owed. He did not shout, he did not shoulder, he slid into the space between men the way water slides into a crack and explodes rock over years. He put one hand on the wrist that held Riva's left arm. He put the other under Finnell as if lifting a bull that had been placed too near an edge. "Let go," he told the hands on Riva. "You're hurting a woman who just broke herself open for this town." One hand let go. One did not. The one that did not belonged to a man whose hat had the tidy pinch in the crown of someone who'd practiced looking important. He squeezed harder because eyes were on him. He saw himself reflected in his own polished badge and did not like what he saw. He jerked her arm for emphasis. Pain ripped up into her shoulder. May's voice broke like a dish and then turned into something made from iron. "You let her go or I will make you famous in a way that finds you when you're old and trying to sleep." Fen did not look at May. He did not look at the man. He looked at Riva.
The crowd reacted the way crowds do, all at once and late, and full of extra motions. Someone shouted, "Stop!" in a voice pitched to break glass. Someone else shouted, "Law!" with the panic of a principal being dragged by a wagon. Someone else screamed just to be part of the world at volume. Riva's knees went white hot with pain, and then cold with a strength she had not counted on having twice in one day. She shook the hand off her right arm by turning toward the pain and making it drop in the face of a woman who was not gentle anymore. She slapped the other hand's wrist and felt it let go out of surprise.
Then she stepped into the space Fen had made and put both her hands on the baby where the man who had reached could see them clearly. "Mine," she said, and the word was not a shout. It was something older and sharper that had learned to speak English only because the town would not have understood its first language. Sheriff Brogan appeared on their left like a storm that had been trying all afternoon to pick a precise tree. He reached again. Men who think of themselves as law always believe the next reach will be the one that convinces the world to go still. Judge Aaron's voice carried from the courthouse steps like a bell someone was ringing to call people to a wedding they did not want to attend. Eleanora Quade's curtain moved and went still. Fen shifted his weight, every muscle acknowledging that the next seconds would climb on him with spikes in their boots. He tucked Finnell deeper against his chest until the baby's ear lay just above Fen's heart. Riva saw his jaw go hard and then relax because he decided to use different muscles. He set his feet the way a man sets fence posts before frost. He looked at Brogan, and at the hands, and at the town, and at Riva all at once. "No," he said again. And in the word was a future that did not require permission. This time, Brogan did not reach alone. He reached with 2 deputies, one from each side, and behind them 3 men without badges, but with the particular righteousness of those who have traded their fear of doing wrong for a hunger to be seen doing right. They half-circled. They made teeth. May's arm slid around Riva's waist and made a brace from bone and intention. "Stay behind me," May told her, and then, "No, stay beside me." Her voice had never sounded like that in church because church had never earned it. Dorothea, somewhere behind, found a pan and turned it into a gong without waiting for a reason, as if noise might be its own weapon if wielded correctly. Bietta said a word in a language nobody had learned because they had not needed to until now. Elsie pushed a crate in front of a wheel because a cart rolling would only add calamity to one corner. The men came. Fen did not step back. He stepped forward into the space their reach created and made their geometry wrong. His left arm kept the baby safe. His right hand found a wrist and turned it the way you turn a jar that has been cross-threaded. The man hissed. Fen's shoulder took a shove meant to bull him, absorbed it, and gave back exactly enough to make the pusher find his own feet again. Sheriff Brogan went for the gun he had lost upstairs that morning and discovered his hand had decided it was a bad idea to grab for that shape in this melee. He changed reach mid-motion and went for Fen's throat. Fen bent, and the hand slid off his collarbone like a lesson slipping off a boy who had not asked to be taught. "Stop!" Judge Aaron shouted, and men stopped because they had been trained by stopped voices more than by stopped hands. In the pause, a space cleared enough that light could fall into it and show everyone's faces to everyone else. Riva saw Fen clearly then, the way the veins showed in his temple under the drying blood, the way his eyes made a promise without looking pompous about it, the way his mouth was set not like a hero's, but like a man who had once carried someone bleeding across a long distance and learned how not to drop him. She saw Finnell's tiny fist, 3 wrinkles deep, opened and closed against Fen's shirt as if testing how cloth could be trusted. "Hand him over," Aaron said, not shouting now. "Mr. Morrow, this is your last chance to be a citizen instead of a criminal." Fen's voice, when it came, did not belong to the square. It belonged to the room upstairs, and the barn where the horse had whickered, and the ridge where he had stood in rain before he had learned Riva's name. "If I hand him over," he said, "I will be both." Aaron's blinked, which in a man like him was a confession. "Mr. Morrow," said Brogan, and there was something like admiration in the fatigue of his bones, "you are going to make me do something ugly." "No," Fen said, softer. "You are going to make that choice all by yourself." The deputy on the left lost his patience first. He lunged, not at the baby, not at the mother, but at the man. Fen pivoted and took the deputy's own momentum and offered it the ground. The man hissed, and Fenn's shoulder took a shove meant to bowl him, absorbed it, and gave back exactly enough to make the pusher find his own feet again. Sheriff Brogan went for the gun he had lost upstairs that morning and discovered his hand had decided it was a bad idea to grab for that shape in this melee. He changed reach mid-motion and went for Fenn's throat. Fenn bent, and the hand slid off his collarbone like a lesson slipping off a boy who had not asked to be taught. "Stop!" Judge Aarons shouted, and men stopped because they had been trained by stopped voices more than by stopped hands. In the pause, a space cleared enough that light could fall into it and show everyone's faces to everyone else. Riva saw Fenn clearly then, the way the veins showed in his temple under the drying blood, the way his eyes made a promise without looking pompous about it, the way his mouth was set not like a hero's, but like a man who had once carried someone bleeding across a long distance and learned how not to drop him. She saw Finnell's tiny fist, 3 wrinkles deep, opened and closed against Fenn's shirt as if testing how cloth could be trusted. "Hand him over," Aarons said, not shouting now. "Mr. Morrow, this is your last chance to be a citizen instead of a criminal." Fenn's voice, when it came, did not belong to the square. It belonged to the room upstairs, and the barn where the horse had whickered, and the ridge where he had stood in rain before he had learned Riva the name. "If I hand him over," he said, "I will be both." Aarons blinked, which in a man like him was a confession. "Mr. Morrow," said Brogan, and there was something like admiration in the fatigue of his bones, "you are going to make me do something ugly." "No," Fenn said, softer. "You are going to make that choice all by yourself." The deputy on the left lost his patience first. He lunged, not at the baby, not at the mother, but at the man. Fenn pivoted and took the deputy's own momentum and offered it the ground. The man hissed, and Fenn's shoulder took a shove meant to bowl him, absorbed it, and gave back exactly enough to make the pusher find his own feet again. Sheriff Brogan went for the gun he had lost upstairs that morning and discovered his hand had decided it was a bad idea to grab for that shape in this melee. He changed reach mid-motion and went for Fenn's throat. Fenn bent, and the hand slid off his collarbone like a lesson slipping off a boy who had not asked to be taught. "Stop!" Judge Aarons shouted, and men stopped because they had been trained by stopped voices more than by stopped hands. In the pause, a space cleared enough that light could fall into it and show everyone's faces to everyone else. Riva saw Fenn clearly then, the way the veins showed in his temple under the drying blood, the way his eyes made a promise without looking pompous about it, the way his mouth was set not like a hero's, but like a man who had once carried someone bleeding across a long distance and learned how not to drop him. She saw Finnell's tiny fist, 3 wrinkles deep, opened and closed against Fenn's shirt as if testing how cloth could be trusted. "Hand him over," Aarons said, not shouting now. "Mr. Morrow, this is your last chance to be a citizen instead of a criminal." Fenn's voice, when it came, did not belong to the square. It belonged to the room upstairs, and the barn where the horse had whickered, and the ridge where he had stood in rain before he had learned Riva's name. "If I hand him over," he said, "I will be both." Aarons blinked, which in a man like him was a confession. "Mr. Morrow," said Brogan, and there was something like admiration in the fatigue of his bones, "you are going to make me do something ugly." "No," Fenn said, softer. "You are going to make that choice all by yourself." The deputy on the left lost his patience first. He lunged, not at the baby, not at the mother, but at the man. Fenn pivoted and took the deputy's own momentum and offered it the ground. The man hissed, and Fenn's shoulder took a shove meant to bull him, absorbed it, and gave back exactly enough to make the pusher find his own feet again. Sheriff Brogan went for the gun he had lost upstairs that morning and discovered his hand had decided it was a bad idea to grab for that shape in this melee. He changed reach mid-motion and went for Fenn's throat. Fen bent, and the hand slid off his collarbone like a lesson slipping off a boy who had not asked to be taught. "Stop!" Judge Aarons shouted, and men stopped because they had been trained by stopped voices more than by stopped hands. Only an inch. Only enough to make the crowd move forward and the washwomen gasp and Judge Aarons's jaw clench. Only enough to make the baby wobble one finger's width away from the place where Riva's palm had rested a moment earlier. "Fen," Riva said, and the syllable held every prayer she had never said aloud. His eyes found hers in the sliding second. They were calm. They were not kind. He was busy. "Hold my coat," he said. "Now!" Her hand shot out. Cloth met skin. She gripped, and her grip was the kind that had learned to hold on to ledges and arguments and needles. She held, and he leaned into what she made of his coat, and she became the extra ounce that tips a scale on the side of mercy. The man with the tidy hat made one final, furious yank, and the world chose. It chose a spin, it chose a skid, it chose a collision with the cart's wheel. It chose a tangle of legs and a shout and a sprung rib and a gun kicked half under a barrel. It chose a baby held tight to a chest that would take a bruise better than a soft skull would, and it chose a mother's hand that did not slip even when rain tried to argue it loose. Then it chose stillness. For a breath. For two. For the space between lightning and thunder when you wonder if the storm has decided to learn your name. "Take him!" The man with the tidy hat screamed, teeth bared now, dignity gone, like a hat in wind. "Take the brat!" 3 men moved at once. Fen's arms tightened. Brogan swore. Judge Aarons lifted his hand. The square braced. And the gun the boy had dropped fired again from the puddle where it had fallen, not because a finger was on it, but because weight found the trigger. The sound tore the afternoon. Finnell wailed. Riva reached. Fen did not let go. The shot's echo had not yet finished climbing the courthouse wall when something else entered the square. A noise like hooves but not horses, a clatter like metal that didn't belong to wagons. The crowd parted the way flocks do when a hawk's shadow passes, even when they have not yet seen the hawk. Men turned, women lifted their chins. May's hand found Riva's arm and squeezed hard enough to bruise, the kind of bruise that teaches bones to learn from skin. What came around the corner made the judge's face go the color of paper again, and Sheriff Brogan's mouth go into a straight line he had not used since the war. It was a prison wagon. Not the town's, the state's. Iron bars, padlocks that looked like old arguments, a driver with a hat that said he did not care who in Hallowbend owned what because he took orders from men who did not walk on this street. Beside the wagon rode 2 troopers with carbines slung and expressions made by other places. The driver pulled up, took the measure of the scene with one untroubled glance, and spoke in a voice that had traveled a long road without catching any of the dust. "Order of the circuit. Collection for transport." He slapped a sheaf of papers against the rain just to prove that ink can get wet and still make trouble. "We'll take the infant now." The town made a sound that was not a word and not a cry. The town made a sound like a field catches when fire runs low and then eats sideways. Judge Aarons looked surprised for the first time that day. Sheriff Brogan looked relieved and then ashamed of relief. Eliana Quaid's curtain did not move at all. Fen looked at Riva. Riva looked at Finnell. Finnell breathed. "No," Fen said. And this time the word was not a wall and not a window. It was an oath. He shifted his weight, turned his body, and set his back against the wheel of the prison wagon, the baby under his chin, Riva's hand twisted in his coat, May's breath hot against his shoulder, the town holding its breath, the law leveling itself like a plank across a ravine. The trooper on the left swung his leg off his horse. The driver reached for the bars to swing the little prison door open and make a cradle out of iron. "Don't," Riva whispered. The lock clicked. The trooper stepped. Fen bent his head and kissed Finnell's crown once in the tiny space between threats. Then the trooper's hand closed on Fen's shoulder and, the world, which had been holding its breath for 2 long lungs, finally decided to breathe in or out. It breathed out with a roar as the crowd surged, and somebody, nobody would later agree on who, shoved Fen Morrow hard enough that his boots lost the cobbles, and his body, with the child in it, began to fall. Fen did not try to catch the air. He curled. The motion was instinct, wearing a man's body, shoulder turning, spine bending, ribs gathering like staves to make a barrel around what mattered. His hat went first, spinning under the wagon, catching a wheel spoke, and vanishing. His back found cobble and then the iron lip of the prison wagon's hub. The world made a sound like a skillet dropped, sharp and domestic and terrible in the open square. Riva did not think. She moved the way flame moves when a gust decides to make a meal of it. May's hand was on her arm and then not, because every hand had work to do, and the body finds what is asked of it when there is no time to wonder. The crowd collapsed and expanded at once, like a lung that had been waiting all morning to breathe at this pitch. Someone swore, someone prayed, someone laughed the wrong kind of laugh and swallowed it whole when neighbors turned. The trooper who had laid a hand on Fen's shoulder tried to complete the motion of authority and found he was holding a man, not an object. Fen's weight carried both of them down into the axle. The trooper's fingers raked Fen's collar. The baby cried out, a raw sound, furious and frightened, as if scolding the weather for changing without permission. "Hold him," Fen breathed. And Riva did without knowing when her hands had left the fabric of his coat to find the small hot bundle. Finnel filled her arms with a rightness so complete it starved everything else of air. She staggered with the weight of it, which was not weight at all, but a rebalancing of the day, then squared her stance and took it deep into bone. "Make room," May barked, her voice the iron sound that pulls men back from fires they started on purpose. Dorothea's ladle banged against a barrel to make a bell of the moment. Beata's voice rose in a note that might have been a prayer if a man had sung it, and was instead a thread that stitched the edge of panic to the edge of purpose. Fen rolled, using the iron of the wheel to turn his body, to keep his shoulder between the trooper's grip and the baby that had now moved from his arm to Riva's, but still felt like his responsibility the way a rung in a ladder feels the weight of the man above it. The trooper cursed and grabbed for Fen's collar again. Another trooper slid off his horse with the ankle economy of a man who had learned to do it in mud. "Stand down," Judge Arons snapped from the courthouse steps, voice trying to make a leash out of syllables. "We will not have this in the square." "You called for it," May fired back without turning, and the leash slipped. Sheriff Brogan, in the white-hot corner where relief, embarrassment, and rage share a blanket, lunged to get his hands into the tangle and got elbows for it. Fen's shoulder, the trooper's knee, a crate's edge. Riva saw his badge flash in a dozen small mirrors made of rain between cobbles. The sight struck her as obscene and true. "Back!" someone shouted. Mill Baines, the old man with a limp and a brave mouth, now wielding his cane like a quarterstaff. He swung once, clean, not to break bone, but to wake sense. The trooper ducked and swore. The driver of the prison wagon stood, bracing one boot on the brake lever, taking the measure of Hallowbend the way men take the measure of a ditch. How wide, how deep, how bothersome. Elsie slid, fast and quiet, along the wagon's flank and kicked a chalk under the back wheel. The wagon groaned against its own weight and stayed. Lydia, Mrs. Deemer's mother-in-law, with the authoritative broom, appeared as if from the ground itself and planted her broom bristles first between the trooper and Fen's ribs. "No, you don't get to crush kindness to make paper go quicker." Eleanora Quade's curtain trembled and went still again. The judge's face did something complicated that would look thoughtful in a portrait and looked now like a man trying not to fall off a horse in public. The rain picked up its tempo by one beat. Fen got his knees under him and then wished he hadn't. The trooper's fist found the place above the kidney where a man keeps old pain. Fen folded, but he folded around emptiness. Now, Riva had the child, and Fenn's body was free to be swung like a gate if that was the price. He grabbed the trooper's wrist and pulled. The trooper dropped with him, surprised as much by the deftness as by the refusal. "Enough!" Sheriff Brogan bellowed, his voice the crack after the whip. "All of you, stand off. That's an order." The crowd did not love orders, but they respected volume when it sounded like it could grow teeth. They edged back by inches, a tide sucking its breath. The square widened by a thumb's width. Riva used the space. She pivoted until her back met May's. She stuck like that, like two boards set against one another make a corner the house can lean into when wind comes. Finnell's breath found the little rhythm it liked. His cry dissolved into snuffles and then quieted, the way sky hushes after lightning. Riva swayed because her body remembered how to ease a newborn into sleep, as it also remembered how to stand up to men whose maps did not include the things that mattered.
"Miss Halden," Judge Aarons called, striving for the sort of calm his clerk wrote into minutes. "Please, bring the child to the courthouse. We will do this without savagery." Riva did not look up. She spoke into the small, sweet-smelling space under her own chin. "Nothing that happened here was savage until a man tried to count us." Eleanor Quade's door opened. She stood in her doorway without stepping into the rain, a dark ribbon in a dark dress. She did not call to Riva. She called to the state. "Trooper," she said, and her voice was metal softened by heat. "Stand down." The trooper who had Fenn's collar in his fist hesitated. He did not take orders from women in towns with names he had not heard until the circuit posted them. But he took orders from money. He knew the weight of that voice. He looked at the judge, saw in the set of his mouth that no one was willing to bleed for the uglier version of this moment, and released Fenn's coat with a shove that was both apology and insult. "Courthouse," Aarons said. 9 o'clock was the hour. We are late. We'll hear counsel. We'll take witness." His gaze cut to Brogan. "And we will do it under the roof of law, not under clouds." Fenn sat up, spat red into the cobbles, and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. The blood made a rude, defiant slash there, a flag nobody had ordered, and that still flew. He stood, slow, and Riva felt the fact of him rise through her body like a ladder rung you are grateful to find with your foot before you fall. He looked toward her, not to check the child, she held the child, but to check the woman. She lifted her chin once, and that was enough. "Move," May said, not to the men, but to the people who loved Riva and also to her fear. "We'll walk, we'll count every step. If anyone touches her without asking, I'll take that hand home in a jar like a curiosity." The square, contrary, human, laughed, and the laugh made the air human again. The troopers mounted because they needed to look like cavalry even in a town with no charge worth making. The prison wagon creaked like a sermon-moving house. The judge swept back up his steps with a flurry of papers that pretended to be purpose. Sheriff Brogan wiped his sleeve where soup or blood had made a mark and held his badge like a coin he meant to spend today if he had to. They went. Riva walked with her child. Fenn walked half a step to her left and half a step back where he could meet any hand that mistook the curve of her body for an invitation. May walked on Riva's other side, broader than she had any right to be, her apron like a banner it would be a mistake to snatch. Dorothea, Beata, and Elsie made a moving corner at their backs. Lydia had her broom, Mill Baines had his cane. Fell the clerk came trotting with his ledger under his arm, mother-in-law towing him by the ear of his intentions. The courthouse swallowed them and found it had a lump in its throat. The hall smelled of sawdust and old paper and pipe. The ceiling colored the air the way bad milk colors tea. The benches in the chamber were already thick with bodies. Men leaned forward, women set their elbows wide, children dangled their legs and discovered reverence as a place to hold still. Riva saw the cracks in the plaster and the worn place on the rail where hands had learned to worry instead of do. She thought, if we breathe too hard, this building will blow down like a drunk who has leaned too long against the idea he is upright. "Sit," May said, carefully.
She arranged Riva and the baby with the same brisk tenderness she had used in the barn, as if the law's walls were just another kind of stall, and good midwifery would have to do where justice might fail. Judge Aarons took the bench with ceremony that felt tired and angry with itself. He banged his gavel, which had not had reason to mean anything for so long. It had learned to flirt. It tried for authority and landed at theatrical. This proceeding, and the word looked proud of its own gait, concerns the welfare of an infant called Finnell Halden. The council has petitioned for temporary guardianship, pending a more exhaustive inquiry into the mother's circumstances and the child's prospects. The Quaid estate has offered to support such guardianship. We will hear from the solicitor, from interested parties, and, his mouth tightened, from such witnesses as have gathered in a forum that resembles a stampede. He glanced at the door. The troopers took up posts that made their carbines into punctuation. Advocate Birch stood and smoothed his city coat. He had dried in the time it took to walk here, and the drying had made him crisp and false. He recited a list with the confidence of men who believe lists are magic. Vacancy of father, vacancy of means, vacancy of proof, vacancy of propriety. Each vacancy had a number. Each number wore a hat that said official. Riva watched his mouth move and felt the old anger blot out fear the way a summer storm blots out a sickly sun. Vacancy. As if the work she had done in the last 12 hours didn't count because it had not been written down with ink that claimed to be permanent. As if her full arms were emptiness because they were not a ledger entry. She looked at Finnell's eyelashes and counted them instead of Birch's points. His breath tickled her collarbone. His jaw found that small, stubborn rhythm again, the one that sounded like a drum teaching your heart a better song. "Miss Halden," Birch said at last, turning with the air of a man graciously letting a child speak before the adults ended the discussion. "You wish to say something?" Riva stood, not fast, her body was not interested in haste now, but sure. The room shifted in its seat, a boat redistributing weight. "I worked for my bread," she said. "I paid for my room. I kept to myself. I asked nothing of this town but what I could afford, and I gave more than I was asked when I could spare it. This morning, I gave my body to this child. I am not a vacancy. I am, quite plainly, full." Someone clapped and stopped, embarrassed. Another person hissed and then remembered and turned it into a whisper of, "Here." May crossed her arms and made a pillar of herself, proud and fierce and not blinking. Fenn moved not at all and still managed to look as if he had shifted closer to Riva's voice. "And the father?" Birch smiled in a way he hoped looked paternal. Riva felt the old shame glance off her and shatter somewhere behind her, where women who had survived worse grounded under their heels without looking down. "Absent," she said. "Unnecessary." Gasps. The room loved a word thrown like a horseshoe into a circle. Judge Aarons lifted his gavel, then lowered it without striking. He had enough sense to know that if he hit the wood after that word, it would sound like approval, and there would be hell to pay at supper. "Name him," Elder Pike demanded from the side where the council had arranged themselves like a window nobody had washed. "Name the man who put you in this fix and left." Riva's eyes slid over him and did not stop. "My son's name is Finnell. That is the name that matters." Her mouth softened, and it did not weaken her, it completed her. "If you want to know the name of the person who stayed, it's the one you will all remember, yourselves if you allow us to leave here together." A noise rolled the benches, not applause, not outrage, something heavier, the sound a river makes when it changes course and does not ask permission of the farmers. Birch color shifted toward pomegranate. He glanced at Eleanora Quaid, who was a figure of disciplined stillness 2 rows back, her dark dress a night in daylight, her gloves once more on her lap, as if the hands inside had learned to fold themselves. "We will have witnesses," the judge said, seeking the safety of sequence. "Miss Kettle,"